A tropical sky heavy with heat and distance. Beneath it, two silver shapes drift across the haze, twin-engine P-38 Lightnings, shimmering like ghosts over the endless blue of the Pacific. Their pilots watch their gauges fall, manifold pressure steady, RPM dropping. Then, something unthinkable. They ease their throttles forward, but their engines, almost whispering, don't roar. They purr half asleep as though dead. And yet, the Lightnings don't fall. They glide, steady, confident, hundreds of miles farther than any doctrine said they could. It was a quiet rebellion. A heresy born not from arrogance, but desperation. And at its heart stood a man who once crossed an ocean alone, now crossing the line between genius and madness again. Charles Lindbergh. To most Americans in 1944, he was a ghost of another time. The man who once touched immortality in 1927, flying the Spirit of St. Louis into history. But by the time World War II reached its fever pitch, Lindbergh's legend had soured. His politics, his isolationism, his shadow over the America that chose to fight, all of it had turned him into something darker. And yet, when the Pacific War demanded miracles, it was this same man who brought one. The miracle wasn't a new aircraft or secret fuel. It was knowledge, an idea so simple, so against every pilot's instinct that it sounded insane. To fly farther, by killing your engines. In the official manuals, the P-38's twin Allison V1710 engines were to be run with reverence. 2,400 revolutions per minute in cruise, manifold pressure around 27 inches. Push the engines harder and you'd risk detonation. Push them slower and you'd foul the spark plugs, overheat the cylinders and die over empty ocean. Every pilot had been drilled with that truth. Engines needed speed to stay alive. But Lindbergh didn't believe in dogma. He believed in numbers. From the first time he studied the P-38's performance charts, he saw something the manuals ignored. An engine's true efficiency didn't come from speed, it came from balance. The balance between manifold pressure, revolutions, and the invisible drag of fuel flow. It wasn't a hunch. It was the cold logic of combustion. And so, in a small airfield on New Guinea, Lindbergh began an experiment. He adjusted the mixture, leaner, thinner, barely enough to sustain power. He dropped the RPMs, slower than any sane pilot would dare. 1,700, 1,600, lower. Then he raised the manifold pressure, 30 inches of mercury. To military engineers, that combination was sacrilege. The term was over-square, when manifold pressure exceeded the RPM ratio. It was forbidden, a death sentence for pistons and bearings. But Lindbergh's plane didn't die. It soared. At that setting, the fuel burn dropped from over 100 gallons per hour to roughly 70. A 30% gain, invisible to the eye but monumental across the distances of the Pacific. The range, once 570 miles, stretched beyond 750. Enough to strike targets that had been unreachable, to escort bombers deeper into enemy airspace, and to return home alive. Still, the test meant nothing without belief. And in 1944, belief was currency bought with blood. The pilots of the 475th Fighter Group, hardened men who had fought since the Solomons, laughed when they first heard the idea. To them, Lindbergh was an old man, a civilian, a symbol, not a combat flyer. But the Pacific had a way of silencing arrogance. By that spring, American raids were pushing farther, 400, 500, 600 miles out. Every drop of fuel mattered. Pilots returned on fumes, engines sputtering, sometimes ditching short of base. The P-38 was a marvel of engineering, but it was still chained by its thirst. And so, slowly, curiosity replaced contempt. Lindbergh joined the missions himself. He flew alongside the men, his Lightning marked only with faint insignia, a civilian consultant among warriors. He flew formation, his engines barely whispering, lower RPM, higher manifold pressure, steady as a metronome. He watched their gauges. He watched their fear. One by one, the pilots began to imitate him, at first in disbelief, then in awe. Their airspeed held. The engine stayed cool. The fuel gauges sank slower than ever before. It was as if the rules of flight had changed. In the calm hum of the Pacific air, something profound was happening. The science of war, and the psychology of fear, were colliding. Because this wasn't just about fuel. It was about trust. Every pilot knew the feeling, that primal pulse of the engine beneath you, the rhythm that meant life. To slow it down was to silence your own heartbeat. To run over square felt like stepping into the void. Every instinct screamed don't. And yet the data said do. That conflict, between the human pulse and mechanical logic, defined the war's evolution. Lindbergh understood it better than anyone. He once said, "In a machine's heart there is no fear. Only efficiency." But men aren't machines. And war demands both. As the missions grew longer, the results spoke louder than words. Pilots who flew Lindbergh settings began returning with fuel to spare, sometimes 50-60 gallons more than their wingmen. Those gallons meant survival. They meant time to circle, to fight, to save others. The men stopped laughing. By mid-1944, Lindbergh's settings were being whispered across squadrons. 1,600 revolutions per minute, 30 inches, lean mixture. The phrase "kill your engines" became a quiet mantra. It wasn't about shutting them off, it was about mastering them. Mastering fear itself. The irony was brutal. A man once accused of cowardice, of avoiding war, was now teaching soldiers how to push beyond it. And still Lindbergh was not officially there. The U.S. government had banned him from combat. He was a civilian consultant under Lockheed, not a military officer. Every mission he flew risked scandal. Every flight was unofficial, unrecorded, and yet vital. That secrecy added to the myth. In the jungle airfields of New Guinea, pilots began to speak of him like a legend. The lone eagle returned, flying again. But this time he wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing efficiency, the ghost of wasted potential. Behind him, a doctrine was shifting. By the summer, combat reports confirmed it. The P-38's range had increased dramatically. Raids that once required perilous refueling stops now reached new horizons. Mindanao, the Philippines, even the approaches to Formosa. The Pacific was shrinking. But innovation always comes at a price. The Allison engines, though tough, weren't immortal. Some failed under improper use of Lindbergh's technique. Pilots who misunderstood the method, too lean, too slow, too long, melted pistons or burned valves. The margin between genius and disaster was razor thin. Even Lindbergh knew it. He once wrote in his notes, "Efficiency is a blade, sharp enough to cut victory or our own throat." As his influence grew, so did the debate. To many engineers and commanders, Lindbergh was a liability, a rogue voice defying protocol. To the men in the air, he was a savior. And to history, he would become both. When word reached the top brass that Lindbergh had been flying combat, and even scoring kills, the controversy reignited. His technique was adopted quietly, but his presence remained unofficial. Politics, as always, shadowed progress. Still, the results were undeniable. By late 1944, long-range missions became routine. The same principle, low RPM, high manifold pressure, was applied not just to the P-38, but to other aircraft, P-47s, P-51s, even bombers. The art of efficiency had become a weapon. Lindbergh returned home before the war's end. His name still controversial, his impact immense. But the legacy of his heresy lived on in every pilot who dared to kill their engine and fly beyond the horizon. War had proven his truth. Sometimes the only way to go farther is to let go. The Pacific skies never forgot that silence. The eerie calm of throttled engines, the hum of machines half alive, half dead, carrying men farther than fear ever thought possible. And in that silence, somewhere above the blue expanse, the ghost of a man who once flew alone smiled again. The men who flew with him would remember the sound. Not the roar of engines at war, but the strange calm that came when Lindbergh leveled off, eased his throttles, and the world around him seemed to slow. They said it felt unnatural, as if the plane had stopped breathing. And yet, that was the secret. In a world built on noise and destruction, silence was power. By mid-1944, silence began to travel faster than rumor. Across the Pacific, from New Guinea to the Marianas, flight commanders started quietly experimenting with Lindbergh settings. No one officially called them that, of course. Official records still held to doctrine, afraid of scandal. But pilots shared them in the only way that mattered, in the air, man to man. One squadron would test the settings over the Solomon Sea, flying long, slow arcs at altitude. Another would push north into the burning skies near Truk Lagoon. They learned to lean the mixture until the exhaust flames dimmed from orange to blue. To hold manifold at 30 inches, RPM at 1600. To trust the numbers more than the noise. For some, it felt like surrender, throttling back in enemy territory. For others, it was liberation. A way to cheat the limits of fuel, distance, and fate. And slowly the war itself began to change shape. In late May, reconnaissance pilots of the 18th Fighter Group used Lindbergh's method to photograph new Japanese airfields on Mindanao. Their range had extended so far they returned with half a tank. By June, P-38 squadrons were reaching the oil refineries at Balikpapan, targets once thought untouchable. Lindbergh's idea had become an invisible weapon, as deadly as any bomb. But there was another layer to his revolution, one not written in manuals or flight logs. It was human. Every pilot who flew those missions carried a private war inside him. The fear that the engines might fail, that one miscalculated lean setting would melt a piston over open ocean. The mind played cruel tricks in that quiet. A flicker in the needle. A tremor in the throttle. And then, doubt. Many confessed later that they felt closer to death in those moments of calm than during combat. Because combat was chaos. Immediate, brutal, simple. But Lindbergh's technique demanded faith. To trust an engine when it barely sounded alive. To fight instinct itself. That was a different kind of courage. At Hollandia, one young lieutenant named Charles W. Chuck Smith described watching Lindbergh from the next cockpit. He flew like a ghost, he said. Didn't fidget, didn't adjust, just held it. Everyone else, we were nervous, checking temps, RPMs. He just watched the horizon like he already knew what the engines were thinking. When the mission ended, Smith had used 80 gallons less than usual. He could have turned around and flown back out again. From that day forward he never went back to the old way. The technique spread without fanfare, like a secret code written into the rhythm of flight. It was quiet, uncelebrated, and utterly transformative. The irony was the Japanese never noticed. They assumed the new range of American fighters came from auxiliary tanks or new models. They didn't know it came from a man once exiled by his own country, teaching pilots to fly like machines, calm, measured, unafraid. But even as Lindbergh's method expanded horizons, it deepened an old wound. Because every success reminded him of what he'd lost. Once he had stood as America's golden son, the man who bridged oceans. Now he was a shadow in uniform that wasn't his, fighting for a nation that no longer trusted him. He carried that weight quietly. When he wasn't flying he stayed alone, in tents, in makeshift huts, writing in his logbooks late into the night. His handwriting was precise, mechanical, yet haunted. Engines respond to reason, he wrote. Men respond to belief. Both fail when pushed too far. There was no bitterness in his words. Only calculation, and a trace of sorrow. The other pilots didn't ask about his past. They didn't mention his speeches, his isolationism, or his fall from grace. Out here all that mattered was survival. And in that unspoken agreement, Lindbergh found a kind of redemption. He wasn't chasing fame anymore. He was chasing efficiency, the one form of perfection war hadn't corrupted yet. Each flight became an equation. Altitude, pressure, drag, fuel, distance. Every variable refined until the P-38 became less an aircraft and more a living instrument. When flown properly it could outlast anything. But combat was still waiting, and it had no patience for elegance. In July 1944, near the Marshall Islands, Lindbergh joined a mission escorting bombers toward the enemy stronghold at Woliai. Japanese fighters appeared, streaking in from the sun. The air turned to chaos, tracer rounds cutting through the blue. Lindbergh throttled forward, his engines surging to full power. The silence broke, replaced by the thunder of war. He dove, lined up behind a Ki-43 Oscar. His finger hesitated, then pressed the trigger. The Japanese plane disintegrated in midair. Lindbergh had just scored his first confirmed kill in combat. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The pacifist, the outsider, the man who once stood apart from war, had now killed within it. But war doesn't care for irony. Only results. After the mission he said nothing. He simply cleaned his goggles, noted his fuel usage and returned to his tent. To the men he was no longer a legend, just another pilot who survived. And in that transformation he became more human than ever before. Over the next weeks his method became official policy, unofficially. Squadron briefings began to include phrases like reduced RPM for efficiency and high manifold operation. The numbers were now part of doctrine, though Lindbergh's name rarely appeared beside them. It didn't matter. He wasn't doing this for credit. Every minute of flight saved fuel, every extra mile brought bombers closer to victory. Efficiency had become strategy. And strategy in war saves lives. By August, long-range lightning strikes were hitting Palawan, targets thought unreachable just months before. Escort fighters returned home with fuel to spare, enough to circle to search for downed comrades. Survival rates climbed. Lindbergh had changed the mathematics of the Pacific. And he'd done it without rank, without command, just knowledge. Still, some in the higher echelons resented him. To them he was a reminder of civilian interference, a maverick who defied orders. But the pilots, the ones who lived and died by their engines, knew better. They began calling him the engine whisperer. He never asked for the title. He didn't need to. By then his work spoke louder than words. As the front moved north toward the Philippines, Lindbergh's presence became both an asset and a liability. His methods were now embedded in training manuals, but his identity remained politically radioactive. Commanders quietly requested his departure, not because he'd failed but because he'd succeeded too visibly. And so, just as suddenly as he'd arrived, Lindbergh was gone. His tent stood empty. His notebooks packed away. But the silence he'd taught them remained. Every time a P-38 pilot throttled back over endless water, trusting the slow hum of life at 1600 RPM, Lindbergh was still there, unseen, unheard, but present in every heartbeat of the engine. He had proven a truth that outlived him. The difference between courage and recklessness is often measured in revolutions per minute. The war would go on. But it would never sound the same again. The Pacific was widening into silence. By the fall of 1944, the U.S. had learned to move through it differently, quieter, slower, more efficient. The roar that once defined American air power had softened into a hum of precision. And though few said his name aloud, every pilot knew who had made it possible. From the jungles of New Guinea to the metal runways of Saipan, Lindbergh's ghost traveled with them. Each lightning that lifted off carried his unseen hand on the throttle, an unspoken covenant between man and machine. The islands ahead were no longer stepping stones. They were stages in a larger experiment. The new doctrine, high manifold, low RPM, lean mixture, was proving itself on the grandest scale imaginable. It wasn't just about the P-38 anymore. The technique had crossed platforms. P-47 Thunderbolt units, once infamous for their fuel hunger, began adapting it. Pilots who'd mocked the over-square theory now ran 32 inches at 1,800 revolutions per minute, shaving fuel burn like surgeons trimming seconds from a stopwatch. P-51 Mustangs followed. Even the great four-engine B-24s began incorporating elements of the same logic, squeezing range from physics itself. Every drop of fuel saved meant another island, another strike, another life. To understand the significance, you had to stand on those airfields and listen. The air was thick with heat and the scent of burned 100-octane fuel. Mechanics moved like surgeons under sun-bleached wings, checking plugs, reading cylinder temps, balancing turbochargers. Every adjustment carried risk. A single misfire could kill a pilot hundreds of miles from land. Yet the numbers kept proving themselves. The 475th Fighter Group extended escort range by more than 30%. Bombers that once flew unguarded deep into the Philippines now had lightning shadows overhead the entire way. Pilots could linger, cover rescue ops, or circle until the last bomber cleared the target. The Pacific was becoming smaller by the hour. But with each mile gained, something deeper was shifting, a philosophy of flight itself. For decades, power had been synonymous with noise. The louder the engine, the stronger the pilot felt. To pull back the throttle, to quiet that roar, felt like surrendering control. Now, control meant restraint. Power meant silence. Lindbergh's method was teaching the Air Force a paradox. Victory through moderation. To fly farther, you had to do less. To survive, you had to trust silence. It wasn't just a tactic. It was evolution. By October 1944, as American forces closed on Leyte, Lindbergh technique was no longer a rumor. It had become policy. The phrase, economy cruise, entered the vocabulary of squadron leaders. Training manuals were rewritten. Pilots were now officially taught to maintain high boost pressure and low propeller RPM for maximum range. The forbidden over-square was no longer heresy. It was doctrine. But history rarely rewards its prophets. Lindbergh was gone, recalled home before the system could formally acknowledge him. His name remained classified, omitted from every official report. The credit would be shared among test officers and engineers. The man himself was absent, but his fingerprints were everywhere. Still, not every pilot adapted easily. Inexperienced flyers who tried the settings without understanding the limits often paid dearly. The Allison engines, though rugged, were not forgiving. Too lean a mixture and detonation began silently, inside the cylinders like a hidden disease. Pistons cracked, valves scorched, bearings melted away. The sky was full of quiet failures. It wasn't a trick, it was a discipline. And discipline was what separated mastery from disaster. Among those who understood best were the veterans, men like Major Thomas McGuire and Richard Bong, America's top aces. They studied Lindbergh's method not as myth, but as science. McGuire, meticulous and analytical, pushed his range envelopes further than anyone. He once calculated that using the method, his Lightning could escort bombers to Mindoro, 900 miles round trip, a feat considered impossible months before. He proved it true. Bong, meanwhile, embodied the human side of it, daring, intuitive, reckless in combat but calm in flight. He used the same throttle discipline to stalk Japanese aircraft for hours, striking and fading away like a predator that never tired. Both men credited the same principle, the art of efficiency. War had become a laboratory. Every mission was an experiment in the edge between control and chaos. And at that edge, America was learning the next generation of flight, principles that would outlive the piston engine itself. The logic of over-square power would one day shape the fuel systems of jet aircraft, where efficiency and thrust would be balanced not by instinct, but by data. But none of that mattered in the moment. In 1944, what mattered was reaching home alive. When pilots returned from long missions, they would sit under the wings of their Lightnings, peeling sweat-stained gloves from their hands, and stare at the engines that had carried them farther than faith alone. They'd talk about strange things, mixture ratios, manifold pressure, spark advance, in the same tone that soldiers once spoke of luck or prayer. They were learning to believe in physics. And yet, in that belief, something almost spiritual was taking root. To run a machine at the edge of failure, to coax power from restraint, required a kind of reverence. It was engineering as faith, not blind but earned. They no longer feared the quiet. They understood it. As one pilot wrote in his logbook, when you throttle back and the world falls away, you start to hear the truth. The engine tells you everything you need to know, if you can stand to listen. The Pacific War was now defined by that tension. Silence before violence, calm before chaos. Every flight began with patience, ended with fire. The method worked beyond expectation. By early 1945, U.S. forces were striking Formosa and Okinawa, escorting bombers thousands of miles without refueling. The impossible range had become the new normal. And yet, in every squadron there was a shadow, the sense that this miracle had come from somewhere unspoken. A man who had flown with them then vanished. Lindbergh's notes circulated quietly. His equations, copied by hand, passed from base to base. They were treated like relics, not orders but wisdom. At the top, Washington said little. The Air Corps understood that to credit him publicly would reopen old wounds, political, moral, ideological. But silence had always been his language. Perhaps he would have preferred it that way. Far away in the continental U.S., Lindbergh was writing again. Reports, observations, reflections. His tone was clinical, detached, almost cold. But between the lines you could sense something else. A reconciliation. He wrote, "Technology reflects the soul of its maker. In war we perfect machines faster than we perfect ourselves." It was both confession and warning. The efficiency that had saved so many pilots now echoed into the post-war world, where speed and endurance would soon define nations, not just missions. The same logic that extended flight time in the Pacific would, a few years later, shape the design of long-range bombers and early jet aircraft. The seed had been planted. The P-38 was becoming obsolete, but its lesson was eternal. The measure of progress is not how fast you go, but how far you can endure. And in that endurance, America found something beyond victory, a new way to think. The sky over the western Pacific was a furnace. By early 1945, every island, every mile of airspace between the Philippines and Japan had become a crucible where the limits of man and machine dissolved together. The war was reaching its fever point, and the lightnings that once patrolled the edges of the map now carved paths straight into the Empire's heart. They flew higher, farther, longer, through heat, rain, and silence. Each mission began the same way, throttles forward on the runway roaring to life. Then, once clear of the coastline, the slow ritual of restraint. RPM down to 1600. Mixture leaned until the exhaust whispered pale blue. Throttle steady. Engines that had been bred for fury now whispered like monks in prayer. The world beneath them stretched endless and empty, the shimmer of sea, the thin smoke of distant islands, the fragile arc of the earth itself. For the pilots, it felt like flying on borrowed time. The P-38 had always been a strange aircraft, two fuselages joined by a single purpose. One for the pilot, one for the engines. It was almost symbolic. A human heart paired with two mechanical ones, forever bound in tension. And now those hearts were learning to beat slower. Every pilot who throttled back felt the same doubt. Would it hold? Could a machine built for violence truly sustain itself in gentleness? That was the paradox of Lindbergh's legacy, a lesson of calm taught in the loudest war mankind had ever known. In February, a formation from the 431st Squadron set out on one of the longest escort missions of the war, nearly 1,200 miles round trip to strike targets near Formosa. It was a suicide range by old standards. But this time they had the new doctrine. They flew low power, high pressure, lean mixture. Lindbergh's formula etched into every instrument panel. Hours passed. No failures. No overheating. The bombers hit their targets. The Lightnings returned home with fuel still in their tanks. They had crossed the invisible frontier of range, and proven beyond argument that the impossible could be engineered. For the first time in the Pacific, distance was no longer a weapon the enemy could rely on. Yet in every victory Lindbergh's ghost grew heavier. His name could not be mentioned, his presence never admitted. His technique, now adopted throughout the Pacific Air Forces, carried no signature. Official reports credited revised cruise settings, field innovations, or simply pilot discretion. He had changed the course of air warfare, but history refused to speak his name. Perhaps that anonymity suited him. Perhaps it was his penance. Back home he followed the news through cables and coded letters. Each new range record, each successful mission, was proof that his obsession had mattered. But it came at a price. Every improvement that extended flight also extended reach, and reach in war meant destruction. Efficiency had become the sharpest edge of modern warfare. He wrote again in his private notes, "Man perfects his tools faster than he perfects his soul. We extend our range but not our mercy." Those words would never appear in any official record, but they cut to the heart of the 20th century. Because the same logic that let P-38 stretch across oceans would soon let bombers cross continents. And when that moment came, silence would no longer be a virtue, it would be a shadow. In the spring of 1945, as the U.S. prepared for the final assault on Japan, the doctrine of long-range efficiency reached its ultimate test. The missions from Iwo Jima and Okinawa pushed every margin: heat, fatigue, distance. Every gallon of fuel meant another man's life. Pilots now carried the quiet knowledge that to throttle too high was to die short of home. They flew with patience, with trust, with discipline. And in that discipline, a strange peace existed. One pilot described it later: when you're out there, hours from land, engines humming low, you stop thinking about killing or dying. You think about harmony. Everything becomes numbers, pressure, temperature, time, and for a while you almost forget there's a war. That illusion rarely lasted. Over Okinawa the silence always broke. Kamikazes fell from the clouds. Dogfights erupted in seconds. And the same pilots who had flown for hours in meditative calm suddenly slammed throttles forward, RPM screaming back to life. The Lightnings became beasts again, diving, rolling, firing. Lindbergh's technique wasn't meant for battle, it was meant for survival. But war rarely respected such boundaries. The men learned to shift between calm and chaos, between silence and fury, as easily as changing altitude. It made them more than pilots, it made them students of control. And perhaps that was Lindbergh's final gift, teaching warriors that mastery lay not in aggression but in restraint. When the war finally ended, the P-38's propellers slowed for the last time over a Pacific at peace. Many of the men who had learned his method never knew the full story behind it. They only knew that somehow, somewhere, a man had taught them how to trust the quiet. Charles Lindbergh returned to a country unsure what to make of him. To the public he was still controversial. His politics, his neutrality, his contradictions. To the military he was both asset and embarrassment. But among the men who had flown his numbers, he was remembered differently. They didn't talk about his fame or his speeches. They talked about how far they'd flown, how the engines had held, how the silence had saved them. War forgets many things, but not that kind of truth. The P-38 Lightning itself would fade quickly from service, replaced by the Mustang and then by jets. Its twin-boom shape, once futuristic, became a relic. Yet every new aircraft that came after carried its DNA, the idea that performance wasn't about brute force but balance. When engineers later designed the first long-range jet bombers, the B-47, the B-52, they spoke of cruise efficiency as a core principle. The equations were different, the physics evolved, but the philosophy was identical. High power, low drag. Maximum output for minimum burn. Over square, in spirit, had become the language of the jet age. And behind that philosophy stood the ghost of one man who dared to kill his engines, and in doing so taught a generation how to go twice as far. The war had ended, but the moral question lingered. Had efficiency saved humanity, or made it more dangerous? Lindbergh seemed to ask himself the same. In his post-war writings, he described visiting a bomber plant, watching rows of gleaming aircraft ready to deliver destruction across the world. He admired the engineering, yet recoiled from its purpose. "We build perfection," he wrote, "and then aim it at imperfection." There was something chillingly prophetic in that line. Because the war that his method helped to end had also given birth to the next one, the Cold War, the race for speed, range, and total power. The quiet science of endurance had turned into the doctrine of dominance. Still, for those who remembered the Pacific, the silence of throttled engines remained sacred, a moment of humanity inside the storm. They called it Lindbergh's silence. The sound that meant survival. The calm before victory. The war was over. The noise that had once defined an era, the roar of engines, the thunder of bombs, began to fade from the world's memory. What remained was the silence. The same silence that had once filled the cockpit of a throttled-back P-38 somewhere over the Pacific, stretching endlessly between the living and the dead. Charles Lindbergh stood at that threshold for the rest of his life. He had given the world a method, a way to fly farther, longer, more efficiently. But like every innovation born in war, it came with a debt. The over-square technique he had introduced, high manifold pressure, low RPM, was now standard procedure across aviation. It would guide the design of every long-range bomber, every airliner, every spacecraft to come. The principle was universal: control the burn and you control the future. But that control had a human cost. Because every leap in endurance also made it easier to kill from afar. Lindbergh understood that contradiction more clearly than anyone. He had built the bridge between the heroic and the horrific, between the spirit of exploration and the science of annihilation. He had once been the face of human progress. Now he was its shadow. In the quiet years after the war, he visited the Pacific once more. The airfields were gone, reclaimed by jungle and tide. The wrecks of Lightning still lay in the coral shallows, their aluminum bones gleaming faintly beneath the sun. He stood there a long time listening, not to the sea but to the silence he had taught others to trust. He wrote in his journal, "When I reduced the throttle, the world became wider. We discovered not more power, but more time. And with time, we built both peace and destruction." It was a confession and a warning. Because that small act, easing the throttle, leaning the mixture, had changed the rhythm of war itself. It had redefined what endurance meant. It was no longer just mechanical. It was moral. The power to sustain, to extend, to survive, had become the power to choose. In the years that followed, America's engineers turned Lindbergh's wartime principles into peacetime miracles. The long-range jetliners, the transatlantic routes, even the lunar spacecraft, all of them owed something to the calculus of efficiency born in the Pacific skies. But the echoes of that silence remained in the design. The balance between push and restraint, between speed and patience. The same math that made the P-38 reach Tokyo would one day carry men to the moon. And so, when Apollo 11 broke orbit in 1969, it was, in a way, the final extension of Lindbergh's logic, the perfection of endurance. Armstrong himself would later receive a letter from Lindbergh, congratulating him not for speed or conquest, but for the quiet courage of restraint. Because even at the end of his life, Lindbergh believed the future belonged not to those who shouted loudest, but to those who listened deepest, to the machine, to the air, to themselves. History never forgave him entirely. but the machines did. Every modern pilot who eases back the throttle, who watches fuel flow and listens to the rhythm of the engine, is following an unspoken tradition, the doctrine of calm amid chaos. They are descendants not just of the aces and engineers, but of that quiet man who once told warriors how to fly unless. It was never about economy. It was about survival. About teaching the human race that sometimes, the only way forward is to slow down. In one of his final letters, Lindbergh wrote words that seemed to belong not just to his time but to all time. The more I fly, the more I see that life's purpose is not to reach farther horizons, but to understand the ones we already cross. He died in 1974, buried on a small island in the Pacific, not far from the routes his lightnings once flew. No ceremony. No roar of engines. Only the sound of the ocean wind, carrying the same silence that once filled the skies above the war. And if you listen closely, perhaps you can still hear it, the faint hum of an engine running just above idle, a pilot trusting the impossible balance between power and peace, flying farther than anyone thought possible, in the silence that saved them.